All right, we're at 6:32. I say we crank it up, and if anybody trickles in, then no big deal. And everybody here is familiar with each other, so we don't need to do any intros. We can just jump right in. Why don't you just hit it, Jessica?
Yeah, so welcome back, guys. We're at week number 4.
Yep.
So thank you for sticking with us, and it's really cool to be here today. I was really looking forward to today. It's just like super calming and centering, and I love being with you guys and talking about food. So this is really great in this book. So to get into it really quickly, I will, Melissa is talking. Oh, that's okay. Chat. So I will hop in to the chat just as a reminder to put the Yellowbird dedicated link that we have for the blog, where we have the questions posted and all the resources that y'all share. We put those in there as well. And I have a couple that I'll share as we go through the chapters. So I'm really appreciative, like I said, of y'all being here today. And it's interesting because last week I just happened to have a conversation with our director of product at my job, and she's Black, but her dad is Black and her mom is Jamaican. And we have a group chat with another colleague of mine where we just like talk about hair and talk about eating, all kinds of stuff. And she was talking to me about her hair per usual before a meeting. And she was going through conversations that she has with her children. So she has 3 daughters that range in age from 20 and younger, and how with everything that's kind of happened in the world, how different her views are of her daughters who's older versus who's younger. And she's married to a white guy, and they have biracial children. And so she's realizing some of my conversations probably were different with my oldest than they were with my youngest. And we were just like talking about all of these things about how we grow up differently and how we're talking to each other. And then our software manager comes in, and he's a white guy, and he starts talking to us, and we just started having this conversation just in the workplace before a meeting about racial tension, what's going on. I was sharing with them about the book that I'm reading and that we're talking about right now. And then also he's talking about, shared a couple of podcasts and also books that I will put in the chat. But it was just really cool to kind of just have this non-prepared conversation at work, and how relaxed it was and like non-combative. And I hope that as we're going kind of through life, that becomes easier for a lot of us. And I don't know, it just made me kind of think about that experience and being able to be like in a relaxed environment at work. Like sometimes, you're not supposed to talk about, politics, for example, at work, and people get all weird. But it was really cool just to kind of sit and have talks with them. And I will share the books that he suggested in the podcast. And he was really talking about the vulnerability. He brought up how it's harder sometimes for Black women to be vulnerable, particularly in spaces of work. And so this book was one of those things that he talked about as well. And I will share it with the group in the chat. There's 2 in there, and the other one's about emotional intelligence. Oh, that totally like didn't do right. I'll do it again. So if anybody doesn't have anything else they'd like to talk about or anything, I think we can just kind of jump into it, like Benji said. Oh, I work at Orange Barrel Media. So it's a media agency, and we do huge wallscapes and advertising, and we work on like smart city technology and stuff like that. So yeah, good question. Okay, there we go. Cool. So let's jump right in. I will start on chapter 7. Is inequality due to racism or race? And just to start off, I thought these chapters were really interesting and straightforward and objective. And it also had me asking questions or like feeling affirmed in ways that I didn't know before. And I don't know if anybody has read the chapters before or the meeting or just before. We can go ahead and just kind of jump right in. Um, in chapter 7, Dr. Livingston breaks down these two very clearly and how they intertwine, so racism or race. And throughout the chapter, he speaks to the belief of inherent racial differences and anecdotal evidence supporting beliefs about inherent racial differences. And he breaks down essentialism and dehumanization. Um, and he really goes into depth about these and specifically about the dehumanization and barbarism of Black people and how it's been long believed that skin color is a biological determinant to someone's makeup. The mere fact that placing them, Black people, as subhuman and how that has implications down the line, including even how Black people are treated medically. And I know that in recent conversations with what's been happening with COVID, and vaccinations and kind of that whole thing that's happening, how communities of color or disadvantaged communities are not treated with the same medical care. And thinking about these things or the subjects that he talks about between essentialism and dehumanization, just kind of wanted to think about and talk about how when y'all saw this, how it made you feel, and how you've seen this put into practice. And I'll read the definitions that he has about the evidence that he was speaking of. With defining essentialism is that supporting the idea that beliefs about inherent racial differences, essentialism, and the belief that Blacks are animalistic or inferior, dehumanization, or more prevalent than people may assume. And so he goes on to talk about how this impact of dehumanization of Black Americans is seen clearly in social movements for racial justice, where slogans and calls to action are rooted in pleas for the recognition of full humanity. So I don't know what you guys thought about that, or kind of like those thought processes of thinking of African Americans as, you know, subhuman or superhuman or something that's, you know, not very pleasant.
I was shocked with like, I don't know, what was it, 20-30% of medical students in their first year believing this kind of biological difference, buying into that. And by their third year, of course, 3% believe it. But that was shocking to me.
Yeah.
And speaks a lot to the fact that the disparity in medical treatment, the way that people are treated by doctors, it's like, whoa. I will just add that my daughter recently was in a conference for OBGYN oncologists, and she said the whole focus of the conference was on kind of broadening the approach to kind of including all people, and specifically paying attention to how differences have arisen, the way women of color are treated as opposed to white women. So that was good to hear. The conference focused on that. Was a virtual conference. I haven't asked her specifically what they talked about, but was glad to hear they were looking, included that obviously as a big topic.
Cool.
Something that stood out to me is, and sorry again, I don't know what's going on with my camera, is actually the ways in which sometimes Black people buy into that in very interesting ways. So this idea of being, when I hear Black women say things like we're super women, or we're so strong, or when other women say that about Black women, but it's supposed to be a compliment, I think. But essentially you're saying that you can withstand all levels of pain. You are resilient beyond measure, and therefore whatever you are dealing with, you don't need help. And sometimes also women also not asking for help, right? Believing that that's what they're supposed to be. And what it ultimately does is render particularly Black women subhuman. Like when we talk about people like a Harriet Tubman, the last time I heard somebody talk about this was in reference to Harriet Tubman. She was like a superwoman. She was just like beyond like understanding. No, she was a regular woman. She had like epilepsy because she was beat. Like her skull was like cracked at some point. She was a regular human being. And I think sometimes we kind of shift narratives that get placed on us, and even in people's like, I think, intent to be positive, you ultimately are saying that not so much that whatever you're experiencing is justified, but I don't actually have to think about any systems or institutions that are creating that pain for you because you're built for it.
What Melissa just said reminds me of something that I had seen somebody, and this is a person that I know well and know is definitely an ally, but it just shows you where he talked about even people who believe, like, I don't remember his exact words, but when he said, people who don't rate high in bias but still believe this stuff. And she had posted something about some Black woman's achievements or something, and her comment under it on Facebook was, they're going to save, Black women are going to save us. And it's like, I mean, my response was, not unless white women get on board and start leading the way, because hello, we can't expect that. And that conversation didn't go any further, but it highlighted for me kind of what Melissa's just saying, is that idea is out there, even in supposedly progressive, non-biased communities or areas that, this whole idea that this is where the saving is going to come because.
And speaking of that, like the whole subhuman or superhuman thing, as you continue to go on through the chapter, when he talks about the being essentialized, and he breaks down the difference between disability and disadvantage, and speaking to competitive disadvantage. And so it had me thinking, like, if Black people are stereotyped in some type of way as being like a biologically inferior or biologically not completely human, then how is knowing that, how is a group that we're put in like a competitive disadvantage? Like, even if you think that we're either biologically inferior, it's almost like the opposite kind of. That really kind of stuck out, is I think it's like on page 113 where he talks about that. And so I thought that was like really interesting. And then when it made me also think about the barbarism, like that kind of, I can't remember that movie, but it was like kind of like Tarzan, like damsel in distress. It's like a old school movie, and it's like the Black men are portrayed as like kind of like the aggressor, or kind of all the time, where it's not that way. And it's like, where do you kind of come up with these thoughts? So I thought that was interesting. And in this chapter, he goes through like the principles of civilization and how we were kind of all civilized between like Western and Eastern cultures, and how the invasion, I wouldn't say invasion, but like Europeans going over to like Africa and taking over Egypt, kind of all of those things. And one of the things that he said, after going through kind of all of this historic rhetoric, was that, in short, history shows that it was people of color who civilized white people and not the other way around. And I thought that was really just kind of interesting because I haven't thought of it that way before. It kind of made me think of the Disney movie Pocahontas, like, you know, like when John Smith and he thinks that they're like savages and stuff. And it was just kind of strange that that's the thought process. Um, and one of the things that, because I love Dr. Livingston's optimism throughout the book, and in this chapter, he talks about that he says that race is an illusion and we share vastly more similarities than differences. And the physical differences that do exist are in no way related to our character, competence, or human worth. But it's an easy illusion, but it's not an easy illusion to shake. And it requires a paradigm shift to do so. And I wonder if there's, you know, kind of any thoughts on thinking of race. Like he talks, it's like race is optimism that that racism can be eradicated. And then he talks about in the chapters before this that race as a construct. And now like race and racism as being an illusion. So I wonder if there's any kind of thought processes that y'all thought about in that piece.
I would, I guess, ask in that situation, you know, back to our women of color on the call, how does that make you feel when you hear that from a Black author who's obviously a genius at laying this out? Like, I wonder if when you read that, that scares you or makes you feel, you know, because I'm like, well, that's interesting, but I don't know that am I even the person to say? Do I even get an opinion on that? I wonder how that like feels like, oh, that could be scary, because I don't know if that's true, if it's true, if it is an illusion, because then it feels like it's almost like we're saying, not that it doesn't exist, but that it's even a harder concept to grasp almost. Mm-hmm. Like the Matrix. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's easy to, if you're not really paying attention, or you can make like kind of make this how you want it to be. Like if maybe sometimes depending on how the thought is, like a white person can take comfort in that if it's thought about in the way that it's not intended, like, oh, race is an illusion. It's like, oh, okay, so we're kind of, you know, the way that I'm thinking is like the right way, or it's just kind of can be misconstrued in a way that to answer your question could almost like give a way out to some people. I think race is an illusion. If you were just walking up to like having a conversation with a person of color on the street and you said that, oh, you know, race is an illusion, that person would probably think that you're delusional, like without any context, and maybe to your point, like could possibly be offended by that without the context of saying that on the other way around, the illusion is just because someone looks different than you, like physically, doesn't change like their biological or genetic makeup, like that makes you different. I think that's the illusion piece, at least in the way that I was interpreting it, is that the illusion is, oh, just because this I can do or say or dehumanize or whatever because they're a person of color, like they're not a real human being, so I can do that, and that's an illusion because it's not true, because we are all human beings. But if you were to say that to me, just if we were in conversation, Benji, and you had just met me like 10 minutes ago and you said that, I would be like just preposterously perplexed without context. I don't know if Melissa had anything to add.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Jessica. I think one of the challenges is how do I say this? I think we definitely know that race is a social construct. Mm-hmm. We know that it's not biologically based, but constructs are just as real. They're just different. And so with a construct, it can continue to shift. And the thing, what's very interesting is the identity that has continued to shift over time is how whiteness has been defined. And within the United States, the people who get to walk around and believe that they are unraced are white people. Many white people are not raised understanding that you have a white identity and that means something particular in this social construct, unless you are a white supremacist. and then they're very clear about whiteness in particular kinds of ways. But people who are not in that extreme category, they'll say, no, I'm Polish, or I'm Irish, or we have German ancestry, which is a way of unracing themselves. It's a way of saying, no, I'm not white, I'm this specific thing over here. And it's like, yes, and within this construct that means something. And so I find it, I really often only find white people who say things like that. Like, I don't believe in race, or I see, like, but oftentimes when I hear white people say that, it's as if they are somehow transcended beyond this menial, unintellectual concept of race. Like I've surpassed that. I'm beyond that. And it's like, I don't get to say that. Like I don't get to walk around and be like, I don't see my race. I don't see race because that does not change how people are going to engage with me. That's not going to change all of the statistics and more that Livingston is talking about. Like, that doesn't change the constructs just because I choose to close my eyes. And I think only certain people with particular types of privileges get to act like the construct doesn't exist. And that is the very definition of privilege. And so to me, when someone says that to me, I don't see race, I was like, you are bathing in this privilege and you don't even realize it. And I can't even be in conversation with you because you can't see me.
Yeah.
You can't. And that privilege is grounded in white supremacy. And the fact that you can't see that and you think that you're somehow, and that's coupled with this idea that you think that you've transcended, like you've risen above this idea, further enforces this white supremacist construct, like you are beyond this. Meanwhile, many of us have to stay within it, whether we want to or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd say to them, well, how convenient for you. Yeah, that I mean, that's really what it, like, it's interesting because we ground ourselves in flesh and blood. And so the concept that he's talking about, I can agree with, kind of in that like transcendent, like, yes, I understand the level that you're speaking at, but ultimately we all go put one foot in front of the other and have to go out into, you know, the flesh and blood world of it all and match that ideal. If it is one, we've got to embody it somehow. And that's ultimately where I really, you know, find myself, is just how can I either get out of the way of myself, or how, if I can contribute, or I can be an advocate, or I can fight for anti-racism, where does that, as a 40-year-old, I mean, I talked to Jessica last week about this, like, you know, at some point in there, he's talked about being a man and being over 6 foot. You know, like all of those things, like I'm in the category of, I've got it all. Without really any choice of my own. It's not like I'm like I think I earned it or something. And so when you find yourself there, then you just are, well, what do we do about it? And that's where, and you know, maybe because I'm a doer and I'm a fixer, like I feel like I always got to be like, okay, let's find the solution and then let's work towards it. This just seems so huge and so, you know, I just don't want to be, I feel like if I even had an idea, I would need to go run it by 100 people to say, poke the holes in this, because I obviously was blind for 30 some years of my life to most of this. And now that I can see even a little bit clearly, I realize I must be even more blind than I thought. What else am I not seeing? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that he talks about in this chapter also, that he says a recurring theme throughout my book has been the difference between factual and emotional truth. And speaking about that, along with the racism illusion, along with what Benji, what you were just discussing about like really separating the emotional truth versus factual, like how I feel about a group of people or how I've placed them or the things that I've always thought, first is like the factual objective truths being laid out. And it's almost like it sounds like you're in the space of the middle of kind of the middle of both of those, like, you know, like the emotional truth, but then you're like, I'm seeing the facts at the same time and like knowing the difference. And that's huge in my personal opinion. To really to see that and to understand it and to wrestle with it. Like I had to think last week, like really talk to myself and be like, am I gonna like really kind of go through life just especially with this moment in society that we're in and just being like angry or feeling like there's something that must be done, or like am I going to walk around with this burden of the things that are kind of being brought back to life, or am I going to position myself and continue to position myself in such a way that like I will choose not to, oh, I recognize what it is being a Black woman in America. How am I going to turn that from a burden and make that into just being great at what I want to do? And like it's like sometimes I have to go back and forth between those conversations every so often and be like, I could choose to be angry today or mad about how this is happening or this person doesn't see how they're acting, or am I just going to keep going? And to Melissa's point earlier about the superhuman, like being vulnerable, really being able to have those conversations with people at work or just spontaneously, as that happened last week, that was so refreshing for me. And it's like, okay, I don't have to be in a place that's like that. I can exist and live my life without that burden. So just that made me think about that too.
I mean, Melissa, would you say with your comment there, would you say it's more important to be in the wrestling match, so to speak, with yourself and in the friction, and just stay in that and be okay with being in that friction, because that's where the magic or not magic, but you know what I mean? Like that's where the real work is done.
I don't think anybody should stay there forever, but I think it's an important place to stay. In all of the work that I've done of doing diversity equity training, the thing that gets in the way of whether it be the most quote unquote progressive person to the most ardently racist person is how their self-awareness and how they understand themselves gets in the way of other people's success. And so I don't really work with the ardent racist folks. I work most so with the folks who see themselves trying to do better or trying to do something. And instead I ask, how do you feel about this idea that people of color civilized white people? How does that sit with you? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If it feels wrong in your spirit, if it feels like that, there's no way that can be true. We have I've had Martin Bernal's, he's got 2 volumes, Black Athena. I've had those books for I don't know how long. There's so much documentation of Black and brown folks civilizing each other and everyone else. Like we even have a little story about how the natives helped the pilgrims learn how to grow corn. Don't we tell that every Thanksgiving? Like we have these narratives, right? Or how I never heard his name out loud, but I think it's Onnemesis was a enslaved African who helped to create vaccinations because Africans have been doing it. Been vaccinating, right? The Moors, the Black Moors are the ones that taught folks in Portugal about like air conditioning and things like that. So like we have documentation, but I say to that person, how does that feel in your spirit when someone says that? If it feels wrong, like it feels impossible, then you have a story of Black inferiority. You believe in anti-Blackness. You have to wrestle with that first. If you inherently can't, you find a bunch of different reasons why you can't, have a Black physician, or you feel uncomfortable about living in certain kinds of neighborhoods, or you're not really investigating the kind of story that comes up for you when you see different whomever walking down the street wearing a particular outfit or listening to certain types of music. What story comes up for you? Investigate that. And until folks really deal with a story that they're reading from, I don't want you to act on my behalf, because you can't. Because you can't, you haven't dealt with your stuff yet. And actually, those folks are the ones that get in the way. Because when we talk about things like, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff, oftentimes when people talk about that work, it stays in like this upper middle class kind of corporate kind of talk. But what about Jaquan and them on the corner? Are you thinking about them? Like, are you thinking about Shakisha and them, like in Walmart? How do you think about them? And if you're not thinking about them, and you're only thinking of, well, how do we make sure we include like the Nicholas, what's the dude, the Black dude that graduated from Princeton? If we're only thinking about him, because we've decided that that's what full humanity looks like, then there's no way you can act on my community's behalf, because you've segmented them based on who you feel is fully human and is worthy of your work.
So just throwing this out there, speaking of like the civilization stuff, because I think about cultures a lot. It's like when invasions of like Europeans coming in or what have you, like there's an idea of what civilized is, and why is it that people that act differently or have different cultures or dance differently, if you think like Native Americans or African dance traditional, it's like, no, you got to stop that. Like you have to stop that, because that's not what civilized is. Like that's uncivilized. And speaking of different, like even neighborhoods, for example, that Melissa was talking about, not all neighborhoods or people are disenfranchised, if that makes sense. Like sometimes I wrestle with that. It's like, what your idea of what, oh, you should be and you should be doing this and that. Granted that there are, don't get me wrong, but there are some times where it's okay. Like I think about like my living situation, like it's okay to live on the South Side. There's a vibrant neighborhood here. I don't have to be like New Albany or Upper Arlington or anything like that. Like there's a place for all of that. And so to kind of look down or wherever, it's just interesting that what's determined as being civilized and not. And it makes you think about like gentrification too, and how there are people moving into neighborhoods that were just fine the way that they were, but there was an opportunity to develop. And so it's like, who are you to determine why that is a thing? I don't know. It makes me just kind of think about the complexities of that too. Yeah. Melissa put in the chat, and by less safe, to me, if I'm interpreting that correctly, you stand out more, or like you feeling like you don't belong kind of in those neighborhoods or in communities. It was interesting to me. I have a dear friend that lives in Bexley, and she's Black, and talking about just like the deed on her home. Like the deed on her home was, Black people, Negroes can't live here, can't live in this home. Same in Upper Arlington, that those kind of really existed. And so I get like where that's coming from too. I'm just like kind of feeling unsafe in neighborhoods where I don't see a lot of people that look like me, because it makes me feel like I shouldn't be there.
There's
Anyway,
a, if you, oh, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
It was, so yes, it's not just the standing out, but the consequences of standing out. So there was a woman, and I do this monthly book club. We meet on Mondays, and I forget the book. I feel like we read The Color of Law. I think that's what it is, Rothstein's book on housing and Green Line, like why those restrictive covenants that you mentioned, Jessica, like how they were in there to essentially protect Black white wealth. And so there was this was a white woman in the book club, and she was talking about a conversation she had with another white friend who lived in Bexley. And the woman in Bexley was telling the other woman, like, the police keep pulling over my help. So there's this woman of color, I think it's a Black woman, who gets, she gets dropped off in order to come clean this other woman's house in Bexley. She goes, the police keeps pulling her over, and that's why she keeps being late. And she told me, and she says, like, I don't know what to do. So I called the Bexley police, and the Bexley police said, well, just have her call us every time she leaves or when she's about to enter the neighborhood, so that we know she's coming and we know not to pull her over. And so the woman who owned the house in Bexley was like, well, what should I do? And the woman in the book club was like, why are you even asking? Like, you like, so she was like, well, maybe I should just make sure she calls, or should I give her a phone? Or, like, no, you shouldn't. Like, you need to push back. Your tax dollars are paying the Bexley police. Like, how are you going to leverage? And Bexley's not that big. I feel like you can make some changes, get a couple neighborhoods together. Y'all are all of like 2.5 blocks. Like, I feel like you can do something about it. And so, like, you can say no. You can say, no, that's not okay. No, and this actually what the woman in the book club says. She says, this is what you need to do. You and your friends need to call the Bexley police every time you all leave. Every last one of you all call them every time you leave and say, hey, I'm just letting you know I'm going to the store. Hey, I'm just letting you know I'm on my way back. And then the woman in the book club, she said that her friend said, well, then that sounds ludicrous. She's like, exactly. Exactly. And so, but see, that's when I talk to folks about what privilege is, I said, privilege is the things you don't have to think about. That's where privilege lies. Like, for some people, that sounds like they would have never thought that something like that was happening down the street. I have tons of stories of Black people who either lived there, used to live there, walked through the neighborhood, and are just having these awful experiences. I live in a majority Black neighborhood, have had zero problems. Zero. And so it's just like, what do we mean by safe, right? How are you defining safe? How are you defining good schools? Because those same folks, their kids would go to my child's school. Like, how is he now experiencing these spaces when he walks home? How is he going to experience that? He doesn't have to do any of that in the neighborhood we live in.
Yeah, it's so true. And speaking, that like kind of goes into the segue of chapter 8, where he talks about how some white people, particularly, or people who are, they don't see race or see, participate in racist behavior. And Dr. Livingston writes about indifferences and complicity, and how that plays through the thought processes and behaviors, especially being dismissive of something that doesn't seem real or applies. And we've talked about this in previous conversations where it's been, well, I'm not a racist, so that doesn't apply to me, or I wouldn't behave like that, so that doesn't apply to me. So it becomes, you're becoming complicit in a way because you're dismissing what's happening. You're not being a participant. And from especially those who believe that they truly support diversity and racial justice, there's still this level of how he equates it to people of color often have to deal with not only the hostility from those who oppose diversity, but also with indifferences or even complicity from those who truly believe that they support diversity and racial justice. And how that's another dichotomy of like, well, yeah, you don't participate in some behavior that you deem like undesirable, but at the same time, you're just kind of like, well, it isn't me. It's like a self-preservation thing. Like, it's not me. I'm not harming anyone. So I don't know why you're looking at me if that's like some type of thing. And he really goes on to speak to that, which that's another kind of part of the racial or race construct that I really don't think about as much. Is that if you're not saying anything, that doesn't mean that you don't care or that you're not participating for a lot of people, but it's just kind of being complicit because it's a self-preservation from harm. And he talks about that in this chapter. I actually thought chapter 8 was really, it kind of reminded me of chapter 5 a little bit. Yes. And he says on page 146 that had me thinking about other things. And speaking of being dismissive or complicit, and he says, these dismissive responses, such as, I don't think she meant it that way, or there must be some misunderstanding, or I know her, I know him, Johnny isn't racist, like he would never say anything like that. That these dismissive responses often end up enabling racism and other types of microaggressions, which he defines as a higher tendency to interrupt people of color who are speaking, or ignoring input from people of color, or displaying cold or hostile nonverbal behaviors, manifests racism directly. And so much so that some scholars and practitioners have begun using the term racial harassment in place of microaggression to convey the seriousness of their impact. And I've found that as more of the conversations that we've been having societal-wise to explain what a microaggression is. Because on the outside, it doesn't look that way. It's like, oh, well, you can't ever really tell over email because it's text, so you can't tell tone, but she didn't mean it that way. And you're like, no, like, I know what she's talking about. Like, it almost seems like you're making stuff up, because as someone outside looking in, they don't think that that's like a real thing. And that's also complicit. And I don't know if for most people on this call, like if having heard the word microaggression more often within the last several months, is that something that you've thought about, or something that's like, okay, I kind of don't understand, but get it? Or is it more something that's, it's almost like kind of like it wasn't talked about a lot versus like being a racist, but then there's like this microaggression piece because some people don't even believe that it's real. So I don't know if anyone has kind of had that kind of experience, or wants to talk about what a microaggression experience looks like or is, if there's some confusion.
I think it's interesting to think about it like you just painted it, Jessica, as a harassment, right? Microaggression is actual racial harassment. I never thought of it that way. It's also a lot harder to see it if you're not the subject, right? If you're not receiving it. And so it kind of makes me think of like in violence against women movement, this whole idea of the bystander, and the bystander needing to act and stand up in concrete ways when they see something going on that's just not right. It's hard to do, right? Because it's just hard to jump in when is this something or is this not something, you know? So I don't know if anybody could speak to like, how do you jump when it's not clear?
Yeah.
It's like the mosquito bite. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Same but different. Check that out.
And then one of the, speaking of microaggressions and kind of like this whole subject, that one of the things that he brings up also, which is why I love his writing, is that he's like really objective and like to the points on page 149, and he talks about again the indifference or complicity, but also like the tribalism and group dynamics, and how that that again, the underlying rationale seems to be that white people who express racism are signaling loyalty or white solidarity, which elevates their status among white people and like this group kind of being part of the group. And one of the things that he says that I was kind of speaking to earlier is that white people often prioritize their comfort over Black harm. And I thought that was interesting that he specifically put Black harm. And he goes on to say several sources chronicle the importance of white women's tears, or white lady tears as I've heard them, both in terms of how the distress of white women can take the priority over real harm that is occurring to Black people, and also with regard to how the distress of white women can be weaponized against Black people. And we've talked about the Amy Cooper story that happened in Central Park, where she said that he was attacking her and it clearly wasn't true, and she was crying on the phone, sounding in distress. And how I've had conversations with some of my white peers, and over the last several months to a year, this is their first time ever hearing of like white lady tears or white woman tears, and not really thinking that being a thing or something that's real. But it's interesting that he, and what we kind of talked about earlier about the superhuman piece and the lack of Black women or Black people being able to feel vulnerable or feel like they have human emotions and can express them. Because we see how with, you know, white lady tears, as he calls it, that can be weaponized against Black people, and we've seen that. So I thought that was, I mean, he no holds bar is very objective in putting it out there. But I don't know if anyone had any thoughts about like that piece coming towards it, or was it kind of jarring or something that you hadn't really thought about unless put into a context like this?
I'm gonna say I haven't thought about a lot of this stuff, and it's kind of embarrassing, but to read it, I feel like I need to reread this book like 5 times just to take it all in. It's a lot, it's heavy, and I don't think I've had my head in the sand, but I don't know why it's, yeah. And I don't even know how to express it very well. So that's why I don't say much, but I really enjoyed listening to you guys and sharing stories.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have never witnessed microaggressions, race-related microaggressions, unless I'm just not, like my eyes aren't open and I'm not noticing.
And the thing also about like microaggressions is like, I don't know, like how like Melissa alluded to like the mosquito bite thing. It seems to like all come to a head like once you've hit like a frustration point, and then you express it and people are like, well, what's wrong with you? Like what do you mean? And then you kind of go through your history and your story of like, this is what's been going on. And like it almost sounds like hard to believe kind of thing. You're just like, oh, you're mad about that just because he or she said that. And it's just like, no, over and over and over, and it's happening. But I think it's okay to like not really fully have thought about it that way, but to notice it more. So I think, Jamie, you're all good.
I think it's important that if you want to, Jamie, if you want to, if you start digging into examples of microaggressions, then you'll be like, oh, I've seen like 87 of these. Like, I think it's about seeing examples. Like, for example, a common one that either biracial people or other people of color get is, where are you from? Now, that's not to be confused. No, where are you actually from, right? So if I like meet you and I say, oh, Jamie, where are you from? And you're like, oh, I'm from Toledo. And I go, no, where are you actually from? What it implies is that there's something about you that's different, that signals to me that you don't belong here. So I'm searching for a place that exists outside of the United States. Mm-hmm. So you don't get to say Toledo. You need to say something else. So a woman with, let's say, a heavy Korean accent, you meet her and you say, where are you from? And she says, oh, I'm from Pittsburgh. And you go, no. Where are you actually from? Like, where are your people from? And she's like, Pittsburgh? As if like her answer is wrong. And so what you're essentially saying to her is that she's not American. Her identity, who she is, does not fit into what it means to be from this space. And so essentially that question is saying you don't belong. And so you have to give me an answer that proves me right, that in fact, you don't belong here. So I need a place that exists, that points to another place. Mm-hmm. And so the thing with microaggressions is that oftentimes they're overlooked and they seem small, mm-hmm. right? But it's like death by 1,000 cuts, right? But also it's what's implied. And we have to ask ourselves, do I ask everybody that? Mm-hmm. Like, would I actually ask Jamie that? Like, and she says Toledo's like, no. I sense some Celtic in your appearance. like I think it's Huffman Welsh. Like, where are your people? Like, do we do that? Like, we don't do that to certain people, right? We only seem to do that to people of color. Yeah. Or telling trans folks, oh, you don't even look trans. As if to say to look cis is the goal. Like, as if I'm supposed to look like I was born of this gender. Like, as if that's a compliment. Or saying you speak so well, which implies that you thought I wouldn't speak well, because you don't go around telling everybody that they speak well. You had an assumption that I wouldn't, and I surprised you. And so now you told me. So essentially, this thing that you're calling a compliment actually told me that you had lower expectations of me. So you actually told on yourself.
Exactly. Like the one that irks mine a lot is when like, oh, you're so articulate. And you're just like, okay, so what else was I supposed to be? Like, it's like the expectation of Melissa said, like, oh, you're so articulate. Or I remember one time I was in college and I still haven't told this story to my mom. I was a freshman and my roommate was white. She was like from some small town in Texas. And my parents had dropped me off and dropped off some stuff for me and was talking to her, of course, and being cordial. And then my parents leave. And then she says, wow, your dad, he seems so educated. And I said, my dad's a doctor. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I just kind of looked at her like, is this serious? So it just, to that point, I mean, even now it still catches me off guard, but the articulate one is the one where I'm like, yeah, it's a little one. So it's just interesting to hear like stories. One of the things, I know we're kind of bumping up on time, but that I thought at the end of the book, and I want to know what y'all thought, when he talks about the science of human values, and starting on page 156 about, speaking of competitive individuals and how people are attracted to power, and that are before where he's talked about racism, a lot of racism is about power and being competitive. And it almost kind of made me think about just like life in general, like the way that he speaks of it. And that understanding that competitiveness in their motives and human values, and thinking about, do people really even care about it? Like, do they just care that I'm different and they want to beat me, or they're just, sucked up by their own power and want to beat me? But one of the things he says towards the end is, effectively addressing racism requires a deeper understanding of people's motives and values, and therefore what they will respond to. Will they respond to like a reward of, oh, like, speaking of diversity and inclusion, like, if I do this exercise or participate in this activity, I'll just do it so I can get it over with and keep going, versus like, are they really going to make a change, and like what their motives and values are? And I even will say that as the conversations keep happening more and more, a lot of that sticks in the back of my mind more than I realized of, okay, so why is this person that looks different than me participating? Or, are they just doing this so they can do it and claim that they're not, being complicit or participatory? So when he talked about just at the core of people, and all kind of brought home that the race part is an illusion, and to really look at the core of somebody and their motives and what they're really doing and what they're after, like, that tells a lot about who they are. And it's like, it almost thinks about, okay, like the optimism that racism can be like eradicated, but it's like, if that's the core of that person, like, is that really true? I don't know, just putting it out there. But it made me think of that. Oh yeah, people often say Obama is articulate or speaks well. Yes, it's just it's a thing. Well, that's all I had that prepared and listening. I thought this was like one of our most robust discussions. Lots of resources. It actually felt kind of good. Like, it was a good time.
I was going to ask, so all of these links will be posted up. I mean, I opened a few here, but posted up on the Yellowbird page, the book club page. Okay.
Yes, I have copied every single one, and I will send them over. So they'll be up there for sure.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm kind of with Jamie. I mean, in terms of just like how much is here, that's a lot. And I mean, I work full time, and I want to dive into this deeper, and this is just a great way to hear, other people's reflections on some of this very, very tough stuff, right? That I need to spend some time digging and thinking. And I've been doing some reflecting, writing as well, but it's a lot. So I agree with Jamie.
Well, let me thank everybody for, time is a premium, I know, and to carve out continuously every other week an hour. I think everybody who's on this call tonight has been on every call, and it means a lot to me. I know that my heart is stirred throughout, even when we're not together on the call. Just having it at the forefront of my mind as we see microaggressions, as we see things that we may have not seen otherwise, and now we're kind of circling the wagon every couple of weeks, and continuing the conversation. So just thank you for the commitment to it, and we will have, usually it takes a couple of days to get the editing done till we chop off the front of the dead time and then put it up. But all of the discussions we've had so far are on the Yellowbird YouTube channel. If you have people that want to see those links or share them with, or something that you want to go back and listen to again, they're all, the first three are up. So we'll do that. The same with this one. And if I don't hear from anybody, or if all hearts are clear, then we'll see you back in 2 weeks, 2 Tuesdays. Anybody else have anything they need?
I just wanted to acknowledge that, like, the last time we met was the Tuesday, and we discussed the Chauvin verdict and such.
Yeah.
And by the time I went to bed that night, Makia had been killed.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it was just like, and coming like from that discussion with you all, and then, like having this happen, and it just, I don't know. I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Yeah. I didn't even think it was real. I mean, I got home and I thought, surely this headline is not real.
Mhm.
Like, and yes, yeah.
Mhm.
And at least I've seen some people making, requests for federal intervention in Columbus Police Department finally. But I mean, we've got to do more than just make requests. I mean, if we aren't calling Sheriff Brown's office every day and saying, dude, do something about this. I mean, because I don't think Portman's going to listen, but I mean, I'll call him too. But, I don't know what it takes to get somebody in here. But I mean, I have a 17-year-old who reads to people's eyes as a Black male. And even though she's a female, and she drives in this town. And so it's like, I'm like, where are you going? And when are you going to get there? And you better text me when you get there, and you better text me when you leave. And, so I just wanted to acknowledge that, in the course of 2 weeks that, we'd had one discussion, and then another reality, or not even another reality, the same reality just keep popping up and popping up and popping up. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before we left.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, y'all. Have a good rest of the evening, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all.